The Westbrook orchard had been in Marcus Chen's family for 47 years. His father had planted the first saplings in 1977, when the land was just rolling hills outside a small Tennessee town. Now, the orchard sprawled across 85 acres of perfectly maintained rows, Honeycrisp and Braeburn apples, Anjou and Bosc pears, cherry trees that burst with color each spring. The place was Marcus's sanctuary, his livelihood, and the last meaningful connection he had to his father, who had died when Marcus was 28. At 52 years old, Marcus had inherited more than just land. He'd inherited his father's meticulous nature, his obsessive attention to detail, and his almost spiritual relationship with the soil. Every tree was cataloged. Every seasonal change was documented. The orchard wasn't just a business. It was a shrine to everything his father had believed in: authenticity, tradition, and the honest value of work. The morning of October 15th started like every other morning in autumn. Marcus was out among the trees by 5:30 a.m., checking pH levels in the soil, inspecting for blight, making notes on which sections needed pruning before winter. The sky was that particular shade of purple-gray that comes just before dawn, and the air was cool enough that his breath misted in front of him. He had a thermos of black coffee in his jacket pocket, and the quiet rhythm of his footsteps crunching on the fallen leaves. This was his favorite time, before anyone else was awake, before the world made its demands, before he had to deal with emails or contractors or deliveries, or any of the business logistics that had become increasingly complicated in the last 5 years. The orchard in early morning was just him and the trees and the understanding between them that had been built slowly over decades. By 7:00 a.m., Marcus was back at the main house, a white farmhouse with black shutters that his grandparents had built in 1955. He showered, changed into jeans and a work shirt, and made eggs and toast in the kitchen that still had the original pine cabinets. The house was quiet, empty. His wife, Sarah, had left him 3 years ago. She wanted a life in the city, a husband who talked about something other than soil composition and pest management. They'd divorced amicably. She hadn't fought for the orchard, and he hadn't fought for her. It had all been very civilized and very sad. He turned on the local news while he ate. The weather forecast showed an unusually warm October, which meant he'd need to monitor for certain pests that usually died in the first frost. He made a mental note and finished his breakfast. The first indication that something was wrong came at 9:47 a.m. His phone rang. It was Jim Bradshaw, his neighbor to the south, a man he'd known for 20-some years. "Marcus, Jim, you might want to head down to your front gate." Why?" Marcus asked, already moving toward the window. There's people here, a bunch of trucks. They got some kind of authorization from the HOA. Marcus's stomach dropped. 3 years ago, the land development company had bought up the surrounding acreage and converted it into Westbrook Estates, a planned community with a homeowners association. Marcus's orchard had been grandfathered in as an agricultural exemption, but he was technically within their boundaries. He'd had minimal interaction with the HOA, and he intended to keep it that way. "I'll be right there," he said, and ended the call. He drove his truck down the half-mile gravel drive that connected the main house to the front gates. The gates themselves were old wrought iron, original to the property, installed by his great-grandfather in the 1920s. They'd been designed to be beautiful and imposing in equal measure, and they had aged into something that looked almost medieval. What he saw when he reached the gates made him stop the truck entirely. There were 5 commercial produce trucks lined up along the road, their engines idling. He could see Westbrook Fresh Farms printed on the side in aggressively modern fonts. Behind the truck stood a small cluster of people, and at their center was a woman he'd never seen before. She was blonde, maybe in her mid-50s, wearing a cream-colored blazer and designer sunglasses despite the overcast morning. Her posture was rigid with authority. "Marcus Chen," she called out, spotting his truck and walking toward the gates. "I'm Pamela Westbrook, president of the Westbrook Estates HOA board." Marcus got out of his truck slowly. Up close, he could see that Pamela Westbrook had the kind of face that had been aggressively maintained. Tight skin, perfectly applied makeup, lips that looked like they'd never naturally curved into a genuine smile. "What's happening here?" he asked, keeping his voice level. "There's been a wonderful opportunity," Pamela said, gesturing toward the trucks like they were gifts she'd personally arranged. "As you know, your orchard is within the Westbrook Estates development. We've been looking for ways to leverage our assets to increase property values. We've contracted with a commercial produce distributor to use your orchard as a staging area and fulfillment center for a local farm-to-table initiative. Marcus stared at her. I'm sorry, did you say use my orchard? Yes, it's perfect, really. They'll bring produce in during off hours, process it here, and distribute it within the community. It activates what is essentially dead land and creates a revenue stream that benefits the entire HOA. The board voted on it 3 weeks ago. 3 weeks ago, Marcus repeated. His mind was moving slowly, trying to catch up. You voted on something on my private property without consulting me. Your property is within our development boundaries, Pamela said, her tone taking on a patient, condescending quality, like she was explaining something obvious to a child. The board has authority over all common areas and their commercial utilization. It's in the CC and RS. My orchard is not a common area. It's private property, agricultural exempt. The exemption is for agricultural use, Pamela said. This is agricultural, what's the problem? Marcus felt something tighten in his chest. The problem is that I didn't agree to this. The problem is that this is my family's land, and I have no interest in having commercial operations set up here. The problem is that you're trespassing. Pamela lowered her sunglasses, and her eyes were cold. The CC and RS state that the HOA board has authority over property utilization within the development. We have every right to be here. And frankly, Mr. Chen, I would suggest being cooperative. The board is trying to work with you. We could just as easily move the operation elsewhere, but I'd advise against that. It would be unfortunate if the board decided to enforce architectural compliance reviews on your property. The threat was unmistakable. That's not an architectural issue, Marcus said quietly. No, but we could do a full audit, Pamela said, smiling now in a way that made his skin crawl. I'm sure there are dozens of violations, unchecked structure modifications, non-compliant fencing, outdated electrical installations. Wouldn't want that. Better to just let us do what we're here to do. She reached into her purse and pulled out a stack of papers. Here's our operating plan and timeline. We'll be bringing trucks in every Tuesday and Friday, beginning tomorrow. You'll need to ensure the gates are accessible. We'll obviously need the eastern access road widened for commercial traffic, and we'll be clearing a section of trees near the property line to create a processing facility. Marcus's voice came out very quietly, clearing the trees. Just a small section, maybe 100 trees, it's nothing compared to the overall acreage. Get off my land. Pamela's expression shifted, a subtle hardening that suggested she wasn't accustomed to being told no. I understand you're upset. Why don't you review the documents, take some time, and we can discuss this more rationally. We'll start tomorrow morning at 6. The trucks will be here. She turned and walked back to her group. They began organizing themselves, calling out to each other about logistics and scheduling. None of them looked at Marcus. He stood by his truck for a long time after they left, the papers from Pamela still in his hands. His fingers shook as he read through the operating plan. They had it all mapped out. Delivery schedules, facility layouts, distribution routes. They'd even included renderings of what the processing area would look like. A utilitarian metal structure that looked like it belonged in an industrial park, not in the middle of his orchard. One detail made him go cold. The plan called for up to 2,000 pounds of produced throughput daily, which meant trucks full of non-local produce, apples from Washington, pears from California, whatever else they could source cheap, would come to his orchard, be repackaged with his family's reputation, and sold as local product to the Westbrook Estates community and beyond. They were going to use his name, his land, and his legacy to commit fraud. He drove back to the house in a state of numb shock. Inside, he poured a glass of whiskey even though it was not quite 11:00 a.m. and sat at his kitchen table with the papers spread in front of him. The CC and RS were dense, full of legal language, but the essential point was clear. The HOA board claimed authority over common areas and their commercial utilization. The question was whether his orchard, though marked as private property, fell under common areas in their interpretation. He called his lawyer, a woman named Patricia Hayes who handled his business contracts. This is aggressive, Patricia said after Marcus had explained the situation. The CC and RS usually have specific definitions of common areas. Let me review the language. But Marcus, even if you're in the right legally, this is going to be expensive. HOA disputes can drag on for months or years. They want to clear 100 of my trees, Marcus said. They're going to repackage cheap produce as local product from my family's orchard. They basically threatened me with harassment if I didn't comply. That's a different issue, Patricia said, her tone shifting to something more serious. The threat, that's potentially extortionate. If they said they'd conduct architectural audits unless you cooperated and those audits don't actually serve a legitimate safety purpose, that could be actionable. Let me look at what we're dealing with. Send me everything they gave you. He scanned the documents and emailed them over. Then he sat and waited, the papers in front of him like an indictment. Patricia called back 2 hours later. Okay, she said. Here's the situation. The CC and RS do give the board authority over common areas, but your orchard is explicitly listed as private property in the development agreement. The agricultural exemption is tied specifically to your property. They're overreaching. So I can stop them? Probably, but Marcus, they'll fight it. They have a lawyer on retainer. Every HOA does. This is going to cost you somewhere between $5,000 and $10,000 in legal fees, and it might take 2 to 3 months to resolve. And in the meantime, they might try to move forward anyway, which would mean you'd need an injunction. An injunction, that word hung in the air between them. How much would that cost? 3,000 to 4,000 on top of everything else, and we'd need to file it fast. Marcus closed his eyes. Do it. File for the injunction. I don't want those trucks on my property. I'm on it, Patricia said. I'll need a few hours to draft it, but we'll have it to the court by end of business today. They'll probably grant it. It's a pretty clear overreach. But Marcus, understand that this escalates things. Once you file, Pamela Westbrook is going to see you as an enemy. She already does, he said. After he hung up, Marcus walked the orchard for hours. He needed the trees to settle him, needed to feel the ground under his feet and remember why he was fighting. He walked the eastern section first, the 100 trees they wanted to clear. They were young trees, only 20 years old, but they were healthy and productive. His father had planted many of them himself. Marcus had spent years nursing them through droughts and pests and the simple uncertainties of agricultural life. The thought of them being reduced to mulch, of the space being filled with a metal processing facility and delivery trucks, made something dark and terrifying unfold in his chest. He called Jim Bradshaw back and asked if he could come over. Jim was a retired contractor, a solid man in his 60s who'd always been reasonable. They sat on Jim's back porch with cold beers, and Marcus explained the situation. That woman's been throwing her weight around since she moved to the development, Jim said, shaking his head. She's on the HOA board and she acts like she owns the entire county. Last month she came to my house because my mailbox was too weathered, not broken, just weathered, said it violated the architectural guidelines. What did you do? I told her to get bent, Jim said simply. But that was mailbox. You're talking about your whole life's work here. My lawyer's filing for an injunction tomorrow. Good, Jim said. Make it loud, make it public. People don't like bullies, especially around here. People value independence. That evening, Marcus went to bed early but didn't sleep. He lay in the dark, staring at the ceiling, his mind running through scenarios. He imagined the morning trucks arriving despite the injunction, imagined the legal battle stretching on for months, imagined eventually losing and standing by while his trees were cleared. He also imagined fighting. He imagined making it impossible for them to operate. He imagined making Pamela Westbrook regret the day she ever walked onto his land. By 3:00 a.m., he still hadn't slept, but he had an idea forming. It was dark and petty and probably not the high road, but it had the shape of justice in it, and it gave him something like hope. The next morning, Patricia called at 8:00 a.m. Injunction is filed, she said. Judge Moreland signed it at 7 this morning. The HOA is enjoined from accessing your property or utilizing it for commercial purposes pending resolution of the property dispute. They'll be notified by noon. What happens now? Marcus asked. Now we get their response. They'll probably argue their position, maybe file a countermotion. We'll exchange briefs. Could take a few weeks to get a hearing. But Marcus, the judge also noted in his order that the HOA's conduct appears to exceed its authority as stated in the CC and RS. That's good for us. That's the judge saying they're probably wrong. Relief flooded through him, but it was tempered by something else. A lingering anger that an injunction had even been necessary. Thank you, Patricia. Send me the bill. He hung up and walked to the front gate. The trucks weren't there. He'd expected them to show up despite the threat of an injunction, but they hadn't. Maybe the injunction had already been communicated. Maybe Pamela had backed down. For a moment, he allowed himself to feel that this was over. It was not over. At 2:47 p.m., an email arrived in Marcus's inbox. It was from the HOA's lawyer, a man named Richard Cray. The email was professional in tone but brutal in implication. The HOA was appealing the injunction. They were also threatening to conduct a comprehensive property compliance review of the orchard, which could result in citations and fines. They were also, the email noted, exploring whether the property qualifies for rezoning to force alignment with common area designations. In other words, they were escalating. Marcus read the email 3 times. His hands were shaking by the end. He called Patricia immediately. "This is standard intimidation," she said, though her tone suggested she was worried. "The appeal will take time. The property compliance review is a bluff. They can't just randomly audit your property without cause. And the rezoning threat is very unlikely because it would require county intervention, which almost never happens for private agricultural land." "But they're going to try." "Yes," Patricia said, "they're going to try." That night, Marcus sat in his kitchen with a legal pad and started writing out his options. Option 1 was to continue the legal fight and hope he won. Option 2 was to negotiate some kind of settlement. Option 3 was something he hadn't yet articulated, but was forming in the back of his mind like a storm system. A way to make it too costly for them to pursue. A way to create consequences severe enough that they'd abandon the whole thing. He thought about his father, who had built this orchard from nothing through sheer stubbornness and vision. He thought about how his father had never compromised on principle, even when compromise would have been easier. And he thought about Pamela Westbrook, with her threatening smile and her designer sunglasses, who had looked at his life's work and seen only opportunity. By 11:00 p.m., Marcus had made a decision. He wasn't going to passively wait for the legal system to work. He was going to ensure that they paid a price for trying to take what wasn't theirs. He went to the front gate and checked the locking mechanism. It was an old electronic system, installed in the late 1990s. It had a physical override, a key that would engage a manual lock mechanism that physically barred the gates closed. His father had always kept a key on a hook in the main house. Marcus found it easily and held it in his palm. Solid, heavy, real. Tomorrow, he would need to make sure the gates were locked. And he would need to make sure they stayed locked until Pamela Westbrook understood what it meant to take from someone who had nothing left to lose. The legal world moved slowly, but Marcus's plans moved faster. Over the next 4 days, he systematically prepared the orchard for what he now thought of as a siege. He installed additional security cameras at the main gate and along the eastern perimeter. He reinforced the physical locking mechanism on the gates themselves with a heavy-duty bolt that could only be engaged from inside the property. He checked and rechecked the entrances. There were only 2 ways in and out: the main gate at the front and an older, narrower gate on the eastern edge that had once been used for equipment access. He sealed the eastern gate shut with a chain and padlock. It was on Tuesday morning, the day the trucks were originally supposed to start arriving, that Pamela Westbrook called. "Mr. Chen," she said, her voice tight, "I need you to unlock your gates. We have a delivery scheduled." "The injunction prevents you from accessing my property," Marcus said calmly. "Those gates stay locked until the court decides this matter." "The injunction prevents us from operating a commercial facility. We're not trying to operate anything. We just need to bring trucks in to stage the operation setup. That's not commercial activity, that's preparation." "Still no," Marcus said and hung up. 40 minutes later, his phone rang again. This time it was Richard Cray, the HOA's lawyer. "Mr. Chen, you need to understand something. The CC and RS give the HOA access rights to all properties within the development for purposes of assessment and maintenance. You can't restrict us from accessing your property." "My property is agricultural exempt and private. You have no access rights." "We're going to argue that position, and I'd suggest you reconsider your confrontational approach. We're willing to work with you. We always have been. But you're making this adversarial, which is going to cost you money, time, and stress." "Then I guess you shouldn't have tried to steal my property," Marcus said and hung up. The pattern repeated: calls from Pamela, calls from her lawyer, increasingly aggressive emails about compliance and access rights. Marcus didn't answer the calls anymore. He let them go to voicemail. Instead, he focused on making sure everything was documented. He had cameras recording. He kept a detailed log of every call, every email. He was building a record. On Thursday, he got a text message from an unknown number. "Unlock the gates or we will pursue legal remedies against you personally. This is your only warning." Marcus screenshotted it and sent it to Patricia. "That sounds like a threat of harassment," Patricia said. "Don't respond to it. I'm documenting everything. If they continue this, we might have a counterclaim for tortious interference or something similar. They're pushing very hard. They must want something very badly about this." Marcus thought about that. Why did they want it so badly? The operating plan they'd showed him mentioned revenue, but he didn't think that was the real driver. Pamela was too controlling, too personally invested. And then he understood. He did a property records search for Westbrook Estates Development Company. The developer listed was Westbrook Investments, LLC. The managing partner was Pamela Westbrook. She didn't just have a financial interest in using his land as a distribution center. She was the developer. Any increase in property values from the project fed directly to her bottom line. It wasn't about community benefit at all. It was about her making money. He called Patricia with this information. "That's important," Patricia said. "That changes the motive. She's not acting in her capacity as HOA president. She's acting as a developer with a financial interest. That's a conflict of interest. We can use that in the hearing. That's good, Marcus. That helps us." Over the next week, Marcus continued his preparation. He inventoried the orchard, took photographs of every section, documented the condition and age of the trees. If they tried to force development, he wanted evidence of what would be lost. He also reached out to some local environmental groups, the Tennessee Preservation Alliance and the Middle Tennessee Farmers Coalition. Both expressed concern about the precedent of an HOA overriding agricultural exemptions. The legal filings continued. The HOA appealed the injunction. Richard Cray filed a motion arguing that the agricultural exemption was outdated and that the community had a right to utilize underutilized land. He also filed a demand that Marcus allow an inspection of the property to document potential violations and safety concerns. Patricia filed countermotions. She argued that the conflict of interest made the entire process suspect. She noted that there was no emergency that would justify overriding legal exemptions. She detailed the specific damages that would result from tree removal. And then, on a Friday morning, a sheriff's deputy showed up at the gate. Marcus saw him from the house, a man in uniform standing at the gate looking at the camera. He came out to meet him. "Mr. Chen," the deputy asked. "That's me. I have a summons for you." The deputy handed over an official-looking envelope. "The HOA is suing you for breach of CC&R provisions, interference with authorized operations, and wrongful restriction of access. The hearing is scheduled for November 2nd. Marcus took the envelope with a steady hand, but his insides had gone cold. A lawsuit. They were actually suing him. "Thank you," he said to the deputy, who looked uncomfortable. "I'm just delivering the paperwork, sir," the deputy said. "But for what it's worth, I live in the development. That HOA board is out of hand. Good luck." After the deputy left, Marcus sat in his kitchen with the legal complaint in front of him. The HOA was claiming that the CC and RS gave them authority over all areas within the development boundaries, and that Marcus's restriction of access violated his obligations as a property owner within those boundaries. They wanted the court to order him to provide access, to open his gates, and to comply with the commercial development plan. The amount they were suing for was $250,000, the projected value of the first 5 years of the operation, plus legal fees and damages. $250,000. Patricia called before he even had to reach out to her. "I got notification," she said. "This is aggressive, but it's also a sign that they're getting desperate. They wouldn't be suing if they were confident in their position. This is a bluff." "What do I do?" "We respond to the complaint. We file motions to dismiss. We continue building our case. And Marcus, we need to start thinking about public pressure. These boards respond to community opinion. If people in the development know what's happening, know that they're trying to use community authority to benefit a developer's private company, they might push back." That evening, Marcus made a decision. He invited Jim Bradshaw and a few other neighbors, people he trusted, over to his house. He showed them the original operating plan, the legal filings, the property records showing Pamela's financial interest. He explained what was happening in clear terms. "They're using community authority to steal my land and use my reputation to sell cheap produce as local product," he told them. "And they're threatening legal action to make me cooperate." Jim shook his head angry. "That's not right. That's not what an HOA is supposed to do." "I need you to know what's happening," Marcus said, "because this is going to get worse before it gets better, and I need people to understand the truth." Word spread through the development like fire. Within days, Marcus's phone was ringing with calls from neighbors asking what was going on. Some were supportive, some were worried about property values and the precedent, but most were furious at Pamela Westbrook. She responded by doubling down. On October 31st, 3 days before the hearing, a letter arrived via certified mail. It was from Pamela directly to Marcus. It was not a legal letter, it was personal. It read, "Mr. Chen, you have made yourself an adversary to this community. I have dedicated myself to building something special at Westbrook Estates, something that benefits everyone. Your refusal to be a team player threatens that vision. I suggest you reconsider. We are prepared to pursue every legal option available to us. I have already documented safety violations on your property, unstable fencing, outdated electrical, potential water contamination. If you do not cooperate with the approved development plan, I will file complaints with the county, the state environmental authority, and the agricultural department. I will tie you up in regulatory hell for years. This is not a threat. This is a promise. Open your gates or I will destroy you." Marcus read it 3 times, then he called Patricia. "This is the evidence we need," Patricia said, and her voice was different now, less cautious, more certain. "This is explicit. She's threatening regulatory action in retaliation for refusing her commercial plan. That's illegal. That's potentially tortious interference. This letter, Marcus, this letter is gold." "She's going to destroy me," Marcus said quietly. "No," Patricia said with conviction. "She's not. You're going to show this to the judge, and the judge is going to understand exactly what kind of person she is and exactly what kind of organization she's running. This hearing is 3 days away. We're going to win this. I'm certain now." But Marcus wasn't certain. He'd learned that courts were slow and unpredictable. Judges made mistakes. The law was written in a way that favored people with resources and lawyers and persistence, and Pamela had all of those things. That night, he made his decision. He walked the orchard in the dark, something he hadn't done since childhood. The trees were invisible, but he could feel them, could sense their presence in the way the air moved differently around their trunks. He thought about his father again. He thought about what his father would do. His father had never compromised, but his father had also known when to act decisively. The next morning, November 1st, the day before the hearing, Marcus got up early. He showered and dressed and drank his coffee and felt very calm. He had made peace with something. He had decided what he was willing to do. At 7:00 a.m., he sent an email to everyone he knew in the development, all 73 properties. In it, he included copies of the original operating plan, showing that Pamela intended to import non-local produce and repackage it as local. The property records showing that Pamela stood to profit personally from the development. The letter where she threatened to file false, regulatory complaints in retaliation. The court's preliminary finding that the HOA appeared to have exceeded its authority. He titled the email, "HOA Conflict of Interest, What Your Board President Isn't Telling You." He hit send. Within 2 hours, his phone started ringing. Neighbors calling in shock, in anger, demanding answers from the HOA. One woman called to say she was collecting signatures for a recall petition against Pamela. Another man called to say his home's sale had just fallen through because a potential buyer had seen the conflict of interest information and decided the property wasn't worth the risk. By noon, 3 residents had called for an emergency HOA meeting to address the conflict of interest. By 3:00 p.m., Richard Cray called Marcus's lawyer. "We need to talk," he said. "Mr. Westbrook has authorized me to explore a settlement. The hearing will not be productive for anyone. Let's find a way to end this." Patricia called Marcus immediately. "They're panicking," she said. "When people in the development found out about the conflict of interest, they panicked. Pamela can't afford to have this go in front of a judge where all this information becomes public record." They want to make a deal. What kind of deal? That depends on what you want, Patricia said. What do you want, Marcus? Marcus thought about it carefully. I want them off my property. I want the development plan canceled. I want them to issue a statement that the operation will not proceed, and I want them to reimburse me for my legal costs. That's a lot, Patricia said. It's the minimum, Marcus said. The settlement discussions happened fast. Richard Cray called back that evening with a proposal. The HOA would cancel the development plan, issue a statement that the plan had been determined to exceed the HOA's authority and would not proceed, and would pay Marcus $40,000 in legal fees and damages. In exchange, Marcus would agree not to pursue additional claims and to keep the conflict of interest information confidential. Patricia called to discuss it. I would push for more, she said. You could probably get $75,000 or more. They're desperate. They'll pay to make this go away. I don't want her money, Marcus said. I just want her to stop. Is that true? Patricia asked. Or are you afraid that pushing too hard will cause them to back out and go to the hearing anyway? It was a fair question. Marcus sat with it for a moment. Both, he said finally. I want this to be over. I don't want the court drama. I don't want to see her on the witness stand. I just want her to stop and to stay stopped. Then take the deal, Patricia said. $40,000 doesn't cover all of your stress, but it covers your legal costs and it protects your property. That's a win. The settlement was finalized that night. The HOA issued a statement. After careful review of the CC and RS and applicable law, the board has determined that the proposed commercial operation exceeds the board's authority. The plan is hereby canceled, and property access will be restricted to maintenance and assessment purposes only as permitted by law. It was bland corporate speak, but it was a surrender. The hearing scheduled for November 2nd was canceled. The lawsuit was withdrawn. Marcus received the $40,000 check 3 days later. He deposited it but didn't touch it. It sat in his account like evidence of a battle that had been won but not concluded. That evening he walked the orchard again. The trees were still there. The eastern section with 100 young trees was still intact. The processing facility that was supposed to be built didn't exist. Pamela Westbrook's commercial dreams for his property had been stopped. But Marcus felt something unexpected. He wasn't satisfied. The victory felt incomplete. Pamela had retreated, yes, but she hadn't suffered. Her humiliation had been private, contained. She'd paid out some money, but she had the resources to absorb that. She'd lost her plan, but she still had her reputation within the development. Many of the residents there probably didn't even know what had happened. Marcus stood in the dark among his trees and realized something that scared him. He wanted more. He wanted justice that was visible and real and unavoidable. He wanted Pamela Westbrook to pay in a way that would matter. And he thought about those locked gates and about the power of simply saying no. The court filing had been a victory, but it was an abstract legal victory. What he wanted now was something more tangible. He wanted Pamela to understand, truly understand, what it meant to be denied, what it meant to have your plans stopped, what it meant to encounter a boundary you couldn't cross no matter how hard you pushed. He went back to the house and made a phone call. Patricia, he said, I have a question. Am I allowed to restrict HOA access to my property more broadly? What do you mean? I mean, can I tell the HOA that they can't come on my property at all, except in a specific, documented capacity? Patricia was quiet for a moment. Technically, the CC and RS do give them some access rights for certain purposes, but you could certainly restrict it. You could require them to give notice, to have a specific reason to limit it to certain areas. Why? I'm thinking about it, Marcus said, just thinking. After he hung up, Marcus pulled out his laptop and started researching. He looked at other cases where property owners had resisted HOA overreach. He looked at stories of people who had fought back. And as he read, a plan began to form, not a legal plan, not something his lawyer would advise, but something more satisfying than that. It was petty, yes. It was a kind of psychological warfare. But Pamela had made a fundamental mistake when she threatened him. She had assumed that Marcus, because he was reasonable and legal-minded and preferred peace, would always choose those things over resistance. She had underestimated the power of someone who had decided they had nothing more to lose. The first weeks after the settlement were quiet on the surface but turbulent underneath. Marcus found that he couldn't let go of the anger. It sat in his chest like a stone, heavy and immovable, growing heavier with each day that passed. He'd won the legal case, but Pamela remained in charge of the HOA board. She was still there, still making decisions that affected his property, still representing herself as the voice of the community. The settlement had included a confidentiality clause about the conflict of interest issue, but it hadn't required silence about what the HOA had done. Marcus was careful to abide by the legal boundaries, but he also made sure that everyone in the development understood, in broad strokes, that the HOA had overreached and that he had stopped them. Pamela's response was to become more controlling in other areas. She began aggressive enforcement of architectural guidelines throughout the development. 3 residents received citations for minor violations: a mailbox that was slightly faded, a garden shed that was allegedly 2 feet too close to the property line, a retaining wall that was said to violate the aesthetic harmony of the community. Each citation came with a demand to correct the violation within 30 days or face fines. 2 of those residents called Marcus in private to ask his advice. He referred them to Patricia, who agreed to represent them pro bono. She filed motions to challenge the citations, arguing that the HOA was abusing enforcement authority in a pattern of retaliation. The judge agreed, at least partially, and ordered the citations suspended pending further review of the citation process. Pamela had now been publicly opposed twice. The power structure that had seemed so absolute was starting to look fragile. It was mid-November when things began to escalate in a different direction. Marcus received a call from a woman named Sarah Chen, no relation, though the name made him smile darkly. She was a journalist from a regional publication called the Nashville Dispatch. She said she'd heard about the HOA conflict and wanted to do a story. "How did you hear about it?" Marcus asked. "One of your neighbors sent me a tip," Sarah said. "Said there was a story about HOA abuse and corruption that people should know about." "I can't talk about it," Marcus said. "There's a confidentiality agreement." "But you can talk about your own experience," Sarah said. "You can talk about what happened to you. That's not covered by confidentiality." Marcus thought about this. She was right. The confidentiality agreement had been about not discussing the conflict of interest, but the agreement didn't silence him about the fact that the HOA had tried to use his property for commercial purposes or that they'd threatened him. "Let me think about it," he said. He called Patricia. "A journalist," Patricia said. "That's going to escalate things." "I know," Marcus said, "but doesn't the public need to know what's happening? Doesn't the community need to understand what kind of board president they have?" "They do," Patricia agreed. "And you're not violating your settlement agreement by talking about the facts of what happened to you. But Marcus, understand this. Once you go public in the media, this stops being a private dispute. It becomes permanent. It becomes part of the public record, and Pamela is going to retaliate." "How can she retaliate?" Marcus asked. "She's already tried everything." "She's creative," Patricia said, "and she's going to be desperate. Be careful." Marcus met with Sarah Chen at a coffee shop in town on a Thursday afternoon. He brought copies of the original operating plan, the threatening letter from Pamela, the legal filings. He explained everything carefully: the attempt to seize his property, the threat to file false regulatory complaints, the settlement he'd reached. "This is significant," Sarah said, taking notes. "This is about a board member using her position for personal financial gain. That's not just HOA drama, that's corruption." "It's Westbrook Estates corruption," Marcus said. "I don't want this to become about me being a difficult neighbor." "I understand," Sarah said. "I'll be fair, I'll let the facts speak for themselves." The article appeared 4 days later in the print edition and online. "Tennessee HOA president accused of conflict of interest in commercial development plan." It was solid journalism. It presented both sides, included statements from both Marcus and Richard Cray on behalf of the HOA, though the HOA ultimately declined comment, and detailed the timeline of events. It noted the settlement and the cancellation of the project. The article was read by 47,000 people in the first day, and it was shared 2,100 times. By the next morning, the story had been picked up by 3 other local news outlets. By evening, it was on the regional news. "Local HOA corruption: how one board member tried to profit while pushing out a family farmer," the headline read. Suddenly, Marcus's quiet battle had a spotlight on it. His phone started ringing constantly. Other people with HOA stories, journalists wanting follow-ups, lawyers wanting to know if he'd consider being part of a class action suit against HOA boards, well-wishers telling him he was a hero. It was overwhelming and validating in equal measure. Pamela's response came on a Friday afternoon. She called an emergency HOA meeting and held it in the community center that served all of Westbrook Estates. 300 residents showed up. Marcus didn't attend, but Jim Bradshaw did and filled him in later. She came out swinging, Jim said. Denied everything, said the media had twisted the story, said you'd made threats against her, said the project was a legitimate community development that you'd personally blocked out of spite. She cried, Marcus. She actually cried and talked about how much she'd sacrificed for the community. Did people believe her? Some, Jim said. Her supporters showed up, but more people asked hard questions. Where was the board discussion about the project? Why was she personally benefiting from it? How did she justify a developer running the HOA? It got messy. There's definitely a movement to remove her from the board. That movement crystallized in the following weeks. A group of residents, led by a woman named Victoria Torres who lived 3 properties over from Marcus, started collecting signatures for a recall petition. They needed 40% of residents to sign to trigger a special election. They got 42% in 3 weeks. The special election for the HOA board was scheduled for December 15th. Pamela announced that she would fight the recall. She hired a public relations consultant to help rebuild her image. She hired an additional lawyer to prepare a countersuit against Marcus for defamation. And then she made a mistake. On November 30th at 6:47 a.m., Marcus's security camera caught Pamela Westbrook standing at his locked front gates. She was alone. She was dressed in workout clothes like she'd been jogging, and she was staring through the gates at his property with an expression of pure rage on her face. She stood there for 11 minutes without moving. Then she turned and jogged away. Marcus watched the footage 3 times. He felt something shift in him as he watched her, a recognition that what had started as a dispute about property rights had transformed into something more personal, more dangerous. She had come to stare at what she couldn't have. She had looked at his locked gates like they were a personal insult. He called Patricia. She was at my gates this morning, Marcus said, just standing there staring. Did she do anything? Patricia asked, her tone carefully cautious. No, she just stood there. Then technically there's no actionable conduct, Patricia said. But Marcus, document it, keep the footage. If this continues, we might need it. The weeks leading up to the HOA election became increasingly bizarre. Pamela's PR consultant created a social media campaign about her vision for the community. Victoria Torres and her group ran counter-campaigns highlighting the conflict of interest and the corruption allegations. Arguments broke out at community events. The Facebook page for Westbrook Estates became a war zone of accusations and counter-accusations. Through it all, Marcus tried to stay out of it. He was tired. He was tired of the drama, tired of being the center of attention, tired of carrying the weight of having done the right thing but still not feeling like it was enough. On December 10th, he received an unexpected email. It was from David Westbrook, Pamela's husband. Mr. Chen, the email said, I'm reaching out to you personally, away from lawyers and boards and public drama. My wife has made some mistakes, but she's not a bad person. She's ambitious, and she got caught up in wanting to do something big for the community. I know you feel wronged, and maybe you have been, but I'm asking you as one man to another to consider a private resolution. She's willing to step down from the board immediately if you'll make a public statement that the media has misrepresented what happened and that there was no actual corruption. Marcus read it twice, then called Patricia. He's trying to negotiate, Patricia said. He's trying to get her off the hook by having you publicly exonerate her. I won't do that, Marcus said. The media didn't misrepresent anything. Then tell him no, Patricia said. But Marcus didn't respond to the email at all. Instead, he forwarded it to Victoria Torres with a note. Thought you should know. 2 days later, at a community forum about the HOA election, Victoria referenced the email publicly. She asked how many people wanted an HOA president who would only resign if paid off with public exoneration. The crowd booed Pamela. By the time the election took place on December 15th, it was no longer a close contest. Pamela received 28% of the vote. Victoria Torres received 61%. Two other candidates split the remainder. Pamela Westbrook was removed from the HOA board. Marcus watched the election results on the local news website. He felt something he hadn't expected, relief but also a strange sense of deflation. The goal had been achieved. Pamela was gone, but he also felt oddly empty. That night, he stood at his gates and thought about locking them. He could lock them now, keep the key, make a statement about property rights and sovereignty. He could keep them locked as a memorial to the battle, as a symbol of resistance. But the truth was simpler and more complicated. He no longer felt like locking them. The anger had metastasized into something more complicated, not quite satisfaction, not quite closure. Just a tired recognition that he had won a battle, but that winning had required him to become someone he didn't entirely recognize. Pamela had tried to take his property. He had stopped her. She had threatened him. He had exposed her. She had fought back. He had fought harder. And now she was gone. Marcus opened the gates that evening. They swung open smoothly with a whisper of hydraulics. He left them open all night and all the next day. A gesture toward normalcy, toward the idea that this ordeal was finished. But even as he opened the gates, he knew something. Pamela Westbrook was not someone who lost gracefully. She was someone who lost badly and then looked for revenge. And in December, when winter really set in and the orchard went dormant, Marcus felt the approach of something darker coming. Pamela Westbrook did not fade away quietly. Instead, she began a campaign of such calculated, quiet harassment that it took Marcus 3 weeks to fully understand what was happening. It started small. The county health department conducted a surprise inspection of his property. The inspector was looking for water safety violations, specifically concerning groundwater that might be contaminated and affecting the community's wells. The inspection found nothing. Marcus's property had passed health inspections every year for the last 15 years. But the inspection was documented, filed, and made part of the public record. Then the county agricultural office did a routine review of his farming practices. Again, nothing was found to be wrong, but it was documented. Then the state environmental authority began an investigation into pesticide use on his property. Once more, nothing was found, but 3 different government agencies now had documentation that suggested Marcus's property was under scrutiny for various violations. It was legal, each inspection was theoretically routine, but the pattern was unmistakable. Patricia called Marcus after he'd mentioned the string of inspections. "This is what she threatened in her letter," Patricia said. "She said she'd tie you up in regulatory hell. She's following through." "But there are no violations," Marcus said. "I know," Patricia said, "but having these investigations on record creates a liability issue. Future buyers will see this. Other farmers will hear about it. Your reputation as someone with a clean operation gets undermined just by the fact that you've been investigated even if nothing was found. It's insidious." "Can we stop it?" "Legally, no. They're within their authority to conduct routine inspections. We could probably file a complaint with the appropriate agencies claiming that the inspections are part of a retaliatory pattern, but that would require proving that Pamela somehow orchestrated them. And even if we proved that, all it would do is make the agencies stop the investigations. It wouldn't undo the damage." Marcus felt something dark unfold in his chest. "So she wins anyway." "Not necessarily," Patricia said. "But she wins if you let her win. You need to get ahead of this. You need to tell your story. You need to explain what's happening to your customers, to other farmers, to people who might buy from you. You need to make the narrative clear before it gets distorted." So Marcus did something he'd never done before. He hired a PR consultant, not someone to fight Pamela, but someone to help him tell his story. The consultant advised him to become a public figure in a way he'd never wanted. She advised him to do interviews, to write an op-ed, to make himself visible. It violated every instinct Marcus had, but he did it. He wrote a piece for the local paper about family farming and the pressures that farmers faced from corporate interests and HOA overreach. He gave an interview to a podcast about property rights. He did a feature story with a photographer about life in the orchard. Each time he told the story slightly differently, but the core message was the same. Family property was sacred, and people who tried to seize it for corporate profit were the real threat to community values. It worked. His reputation recovered. If anything, he became a minor celebrity in agricultural circles, the farmer who'd stood up to HOA corruption. He received emails from other farmers who'd had similar experiences. He was invited to speak at a farming cooperative meeting. He was becoming the narrator of his own story rather than a victim in someone else's narrative. But Pamela was not done. In mid-January, Marcus received a certified letter from David Westbrook's law firm. It was a defamation suit. The suit claimed that Marcus had made false and damaging statements about Pamela in his various interviews, op-eds, and public statements. It claimed she'd suffered emotional distress, damage to her reputation, and harm to her business interests as owner of Westbrook Investments, LLC. She was suing for $500,000. Marcus was stunned. He called Patricia immediately. "This is a SLAPP suit," Patricia said, referring to a strategic lawsuit against public participation. "It's designed to silence you through the cost of defending yourself. Tennessee has anti-SLAPP statutes, which means we can move to dismiss this on the grounds that you were engaging in protected speech about a matter of public concern. But we need to move fast." "How much is this going to cost?" Marcus asked. "To defend, $5,000 to $10,000 probably. But if we win the anti-SLAPP motion, the court will make her pay your legal fees. And if we don't win, then we're in for a long, expensive fight." Patricia filed the anti-SLAPP motion 3 days later. She argued that Marcus's statements were all substantially true, that he was addressing a matter of public concern, HOA corruption and conflicts of interest, and that the defamation suit was clearly retaliatory in nature. The judge's response came 2 weeks later. She denied the anti-SLAPP motion. "The court finds," the ruling stated, "that while some of the defendant's statements appear to relate to matters of public concern, others appear to make factual claims about the plaintiff's intent and motivations that may not be substantially supported by the record. Specifically, characterizations of the plaintiff as having engaged in corruption may exceed what the evidence demonstrates. The case may proceed to discovery." Patricia called Marcus with the news. "This is bad," she said without preamble. "A SLAPP motion denial means the judge thinks there's enough here to proceed. That means we're going into discovery, which means months of litigation, thousands of documents, depositions. And it means we're going to have to defend the truth of every statement you made in every interview, every op-ed." "But everything I said was true," Marcus said. "True in substance, maybe," Patricia said. "But in legal terms, true is very specific. We have to prove that every factual claim you made meets the burden of proof. And the problem is that some of your language was more emotional and interpretive than factual. You called it corruption. The legal definition of corruption is much more specific. You said she was trying to steal your property. Legally, theft requires specific intent. You interpreted her actions through an emotional lens, and now we have to defend every word." The realization hit Marcus like a punch. He had done exactly what Pamela had wanted him to do. He'd become public about what happened, and in doing so, he'd given her a legal weapon. She couldn't silence him, but she could bleed him dry defending his statements. Over the next 3 months, Marcus went through a legal process that was more exhausting than the original property dispute. He had to provide every email he'd sent, every document he possessed, every record of his phone calls with journalists. His deposition lasted 6 hours. Pamela's lawyer grilled him about specific statements he'd made, asking him to define terms, to defend interpretations, to explain nuances. The cost was mounting. Patricia was now charging him $3,500 a month in legal fees. His settlement money from the original case was being spent on defending himself from a case that was essentially about him having defended himself too publicly. And then in April, something unexpected happened. Victoria Torres called Marcus at the orchard. She was the new HOA board president, the woman who had led the recall effort. "I'm calling to tell you something," she said. "The board just received a communication from Pamela's lawyer. She's offering to drop the defamation suit if the new HOA board makes a public statement exonerating her and acknowledging that the conflict of interest allegations were exaggerated and that her leadership of the development was beneficial overall." "And what's the board saying?" Marcus asked. "We're refusing," Victoria said. "Obviously, but I wanted you to know because I think it shows something important. She doesn't actually believe she can win this case. She's just trying to get it to go away, and she's willing to trade the legal fight for reputation rehabilitation." "Can you tell the court that?" Marcus asked. "Can you tell them she offered this deal?" Her lawyer will probably argue that it's settlement negotiation and therefore inadmissible, but I'm documenting it anyway. Patricia, when told about the settlement offer, was more optimistic. This is good, she said. It suggests her legal position is weak. It also suggests she's spending money on a case she knows she can't win. At some point, she's going to decide that continuing is not worth it. We just have to be patient and hold the line. But patience was something Marcus was running out of. It was April now, 5 months since Pamela had lost the HOA election. He'd been dealing with some form of legal battle since October of the previous year. His orchard was doing fine. The trees didn't care about litigation, but his soul was starting to show damage. He was sleeping poorly. He was losing weight. He wasn't maintaining the orchard with his usual obsessive attention. He was becoming, in some ways, what Pamela had wanted him to become, someone too distracted and exhausted to be effective. One morning in late April, Marcus woke up and realized something. He was losing. Maybe not in court, maybe not in public opinion, but he was losing his peace. He was losing his connection to what made the orchard meaningful. He was winning battles but losing the war for his own soul. That afternoon, he called Patricia. "I want to settle," he said. "With the defamation suit?" Patricia asked, confused. "We're winning. The judge is clearly skeptical of our case. We could probably get it dismissed in the next round of motions." "I don't care," Marcus said. "I'm done. I want to offer her a deal. I'll make a statement that my language was intemperate and that I should have been more careful about distinguishing between facts and interpretation. In exchange, she drops the suit and agrees to stay away from my property." "That's basically exonerating her," Patricia said. "I know," Marcus said, "but I need this to end. I can't do this anymore." There was a long pause. "Let me call her lawyer," Patricia said finally. "Let me see if we can structure something." The settlement terms were finalized 2 weeks later. Marcus would issue a public statement acknowledging that his characterizations of Pamela's actions had sometimes exceeded the facts, that he had been emotionally invested in the dispute, and that he regretted the damage to her reputation. In exchange, Pamela would drop the defamation suit and agree to a mutual no-contact agreement with Marcus. The statement was issued on May 8th. It ran in the local paper and on the Westbrook Estates community Facebook page. Within hours, Marcus's phone started ringing with people expressing disappointment, feeling like he'd betrayed them, wondering why he'd backed down. He didn't answer the calls. Instead, he walked to the front gates of his orchard, and for the first time in months he felt something like calm. The battle was over. He had paid a price for it, legal fees totaling nearly $30,000, months of stress, a tarnished reputation. But it was over. He stood at the gates and thought about locking them again, not as a statement but as a simple choice. He could close them. He could lock them. He could return to the isolation that had been his life before all of this. But instead, he left them open. He left them open that night and the next morning and the morning after that. And as days became weeks, he began to understand something important. The gates had never been the real issue. The gates had just been the mechanism through which a deeper conflict had been expressed. Pamela had wanted to use his property. He had refused. She had escalated. He had escalated. They had both been willing to destroy each other over something that, in the end, mattered less than the damage it caused. The settlement had required him to make peace with Pamela's version of events, but it had also, unexpectedly, freed him from having to keep fighting. By the time June arrived, Marcus had stopped checking the news about the HOA. He'd stopped answering questions about the dispute. He'd stopped thinking about Pamela Westbrook altogether. But somewhere in early summer, something changed. A new piece of information began circulating in the Westbrook Estates community. It came from multiple sources, people who'd heard it from people who'd heard it from people, but the story was consistent. Pamela Westbrook had put her house on the market. She and David were leaving the development. They were moving to Florida. When Marcus heard this, he felt a complicated mixture of emotions. Vindication, yes, but also something more unsettling. The realization that his refusal to compromise, his escalation, his public campaign against her, all of it had contributed to driving her out of the community entirely. He had won so completely that his enemy had simply decided to abandon the field. He thought about calling to check if it was true, but he didn't. Instead, he went back to the orchard and did what he did best. He worked. He pruned trees. He checked soil composition. He made notes on which sections needed attention. He reconnected with the world of the living, the growing, the real. The gates remained open all through the summer. And in July, when Marcus ran into Jim Bradshaw at a local farmer's market, Jim told him the news officially. "They're gone," Jim said. "David and Pamela listed their house in May, sold it in June. They're in Clearwater now, Florida, just left." "Good," Marcus said, and meant it. But even as he said it, he was aware of a strange hollowness. The victory felt less like victory and more like the final confirmation of something he'd already lost. Summer faded into autumn, and Marcus found himself standing in his orchard at a moment that should have been triumph but felt like something else entirely. The legal battles were finished. Pamela was gone. The property was safe. Everything he'd fought for had been preserved. The orchard continued as it always had, trees growing, seasons turning, the earth doing what the earth had always done. But something inside Marcus had shifted in a way he couldn't quite articulate. He began noticing it in small ways. He would walk the same paths he'd walked hundreds of times before and feel strange, slightly disassociated from the experience. The trees that had once brought him comfort now sometimes just felt like trees, beautiful, yes, but neutral. The connection he'd always felt with this land, this inherited legacy, had developed a hairline fracture. By August, he'd admitted to himself what was happening. He was depressed. It wasn't the kind of depression that made you unable to function. He still got up at 5:30 a.m. He still checked the soil and pruned branches and maintained the equipment. But it was a depression that drained meaning from these acts. They felt like rituals without purpose, habits without heart. Jim Bradshaw noticed it one morning in early September when Marcus came into the local coffee shop, looking like he hadn't slept in days. "You okay?" Jim asked, settling down at Marcus's table uninvited. "I'm fine," Marcus said, which was the first lie he'd told in weeks. "You don't look fine," Jim said. "You look like you've been through a war." "I have been through a war," Marcus said quietly. "I won, and now I don't know what to do with the victory." Jim was quiet for a moment. "You know what I think," he said. "I think you're not depressed because you won. You're depressed because winning didn't fix what was broken." "What do you mean?" "I mean that you spent 6 months fighting Pamela Westbrook. You were focused on her, on stopping her, on proving she was wrong. That focus, it was terrible, but it was also clarifying. You knew what you were fighting against. And then you won, and the fight was over, and you're left with just your life, which is a good life, but it's not the life you were living when you were at war." "So what am I supposed to do?" Marcus asked. "Get back into a fight?" "No," Jim said. "I'm saying you need to find something new to fight for, not against for. There's a difference." Marcus thought about this over the next few weeks. He thought about what he'd been before all of this, a man running a business, maintaining a legacy, living a quiet life. He thought about what he'd become during the crisis, a warrior, a public figure, someone fighting against corruption and for justice. And he thought about what he was becoming now, someone adrift, someone without a clear purpose. In late September, he made a decision that surprised him. He called a former colleague of his father's, a man named Robert Liu who'd retired to a farm upstate and had become involved in agricultural preservation organizations. "I want to do something with the orchard," Marcus said. "Not just maintain it, do something with it." "Like what?" Robert asked. "I don't know, educational programs, working with local schools, agritourism. Something that connects people to where their food comes from, something that shares what my father built." Robert was quiet for a moment. "That's good," he said. "That's really good. You've been protecting the orchard, now you need to share it." Over the next few months, Marcus began planning. He connected with the local university's agricultural extension program and offered the orchard as a teaching facility. He worked with a group that brought urban kids to farms to see where food came from. He started a farm stand in the main driveway where customers could buy directly from him, and more importantly, where he could talk to them about the orchard, the trees, the history. For the first time since the crisis ended, Marcus felt something close to purpose. But there was another element to his recovery that he didn't fully understand until November, almost exactly a year after the original crisis had begun. He received an email from a lawyer in Florida. The email was regarding a divorce settlement. Apparently, David and Pamela Westbrook were no longer together. David was requesting Marcus's signature on a document indicating that David bore no responsibility for the actions Pamela had taken during the HOA dispute. as they had been made without David's knowledge or consent. Marcus read the email 3 times, then deleted it without responding. The knowledge of the divorce was public a few weeks later. It appeared in the news section of the Florida Bar Association's reporting. David had apparently left the marriage and was starting over. Pamela had contested the divorce aggressively, and the proceedings were becoming nasty. From the documents made public, it appeared that David was claiming she'd been financially reckless and professionally unethical. Somewhere in Florida, Pamela Westbrook was experiencing consequences. Her marriage had ended. Her business partner had abandoned her. Her reputation in her new community was being built on the foundation of a bitter divorce settlement. Marcus felt something when he read this news, but it wasn't satisfaction. It was something more complex, a recognition that taking joy in someone else's pain was a version of defeat. It meant he was still tied to her, still emotionally invested in her downfall. He made a decision that day. He was going to stop following the Pamela Westbrook saga. He was going to stop reading the news about her, stop asking people for updates, stop thinking about what she was doing or where she was or how her life was unfolding. That decision was harder to implement than he'd expected, but he worked at it. He redirected his energy. He focused on the farm programs, on the education initiatives, on rebuilding his connection to the land in a way that was about creation rather than defense. By December, 1 year after Pamela had first sent the threatening letter, Marcus stood in his orchard on the day of the winter solstice and took inventory of what had changed. The property was the same. The trees were the same. The house, the fields, the roads, all the same, but something fundamental had shifted. He was no longer a man defending his inheritance against an external threat. He was a man actively engaged in extending that inheritance, sharing it, expanding what it meant to have a family legacy. The settlement from the original case was still sitting in his account. He'd used about half of it to cover legal fees from the various battles. Now, he decided to use the rest of it purposefully. He endowed a scholarship through the local university's agricultural program in his father's name. He donated money to the Tennessee Preservation Alliance to help protect agricultural land from development encroachment. He was turning the victory into something meaningful beyond the victory itself. And then, in January, something happened that Marcus did not expect. He received a letter from someone named Catherine Wells. She was a journalist from a publication called Modern Farmer, a national magazine focused on agricultural issues. She explained that she'd been following the HOA dispute from its initial news coverage, and she wanted to write a longer, more detailed story about it, not just as a local conflict, but as a symptom of a broader national problem: HOA overreach and the erosion of property rights for agricultural landowners. "I'm interested in your perspective," the letter said, "but I'm also interested in Pamela Westbrook's perspective. I've been trying to reach her, but she's declined to comment. But I wanted to give you fair warning. I'm planning to tell the full story from both sides. I wanted to see if you'd be willing to participate." Marcus read the letter 3 times. It felt like a moment where he had a choice. He could refuse. He could say he was done with the public aspect of this story. He could recede back into privacy. Or he could tell his story one more time, completely, honestly, without the need to win. He called Catherine Wells and agreed to participate. The interview was 2 hours long. Catherine asked detailed questions about his father, about the orchard, about the specific moment when Pamela had first approached the gate. She asked about his fears, his motivations, his regrets. She asked about the legal battles and what he'd learned from them. "Do you regret exposing her publicly?" Catherine asked at one point. "You seem to suggest that fighting back came with its own costs." "I do regret some of it," Marcus said. "I regret escalating when I could have negotiated. I regret letting anger drive my decisions. But I don't regret defending my property. I don't regret standing up to corruption. I just regret doing it in a way that poisoned my own well. I became so focused on winning that I lost sight of why I was fighting in the first place." "And why were you fighting?" Catherine asked. "For this," Marcus said, and he gestured out the window at the orchard. "For my father's legacy. For the idea that some things should be protected, should remain unchanged, should be passed down. But I learned something in the process. Protection isn't the same as growth. You can protect something so fiercely that you trap it. I'm learning how to protect the orchard while also allowing it to grow into something new." The article appeared in Modern Farmer 6 weeks later. It was a comprehensive, beautifully written piece that examined the case not just as a conflict between Marcus and Pamela, but as a microcosm of larger trends in American property rights and community governance. It included interviews with other farmers who'd had similar conflicts with HOAs. It included perspectives from HOA attorneys about the challenges of balancing community authority with property rights. It included a brief statement from Pamela's lawyer declining further comment on the matter. But the heart of the article was Marcus's story, not as a victory narrative, but as a human story about what it costs to fight, what it means to win, and how you begin rebuilding a life after the battle. The article generated significant interest. It was shared widely in agricultural circles. It led to Marcus being invited to speak at farming conferences. It led to him consulting with other farmers who were facing HOA conflicts or property disputes. And through all of it, Marcus felt something he hadn't expected: peace. Not the kind of peace that comes from winning, but the kind that comes from having worked through something difficult and emerged on the other side with deeper understanding. He was no longer at war with Pamela Westbrook. He was no longer even thinking about her as an enemy. She had become, in his mind, a symbol of something he'd had to learn to resist, but also something he'd had to learn to move past. In the spring, when the orchard came into full bloom, Marcus stood among the flowering trees and thought about what he would do differently if he could go back in time. He would tell his younger self to lock the gates sooner, to be more forceful in his refusal. But he would also tell him not to let the fight consume him, not to let his identity become entirely wrapped up in opposition. The trees didn't know about any of this. They just bloomed and grew and produced fruit in the same way they always had. They moved through seasons without judgment or regret. By the time the second autumn arrived, 2 years after Pamela Westbrook had first approached his gates with her construction plans and her confident smile, Marcus Chen had become someone different. Not entirely different. Not so much changed that he wouldn't recognize himself if he looked back, but fundamentally altered in ways that had worked their way into his bones. The orchard was thriving. That had always been true, but now it was thriving with new purpose. The farm education program had expanded to include 3 local schools, bringing nearly 400 students a year to learn about fruit cultivation, soil health, and sustainable agriculture. The farm stand had become a gathering place for the community. People came not just to buy fruit, but to talk to Marcus about their own gardens, to learn about seasonal harvests, to feel connected to something real and growing. The scholarship in his father's name had funded 8 students through the university's agricultural program. 3 of them had already returned to farming after graduation, restarting family operations that had been abandoned a generation earlier. One of them, a woman named Keisha Morrison, had written him a letter saying that his father's scholarship had changed the trajectory of her life, had made her believe that agriculture could be her future. Marcus had framed that letter and hung it in his kitchen. The property was secure. The legal issues had all been resolved, though the process had left marks. He'd spent nearly $50,000 in legal fees across the various disputes. He'd spent months stressed and fighting. He'd let anger consume him in ways that had damaged his health and his sense of self. But all of that was behind him now. Pamela Westbrook had become a ghost story, something people in the development whispered about. How the woman who'd tried to seize property for corporate profit had ended up divorced and moved away. How the farmer had stood against her and won. How sometimes justice, however slowly, comes for those who abuse power. Victoria Torres was now in her 2nd year as HOA president, and she'd reformed the governance structure to be more transparent and accountable. The board no longer had a single executive authority. Decisions required broader community input. The culture of rubber stamp approval and autocratic control had been replaced with actual democratic process. It wasn't perfect, government never was, but it was better. On an October morning very similar to the morning 2 years prior, Marcus stood at his front gates and thought about them. They were the same gates, unchanged. The wrought iron was the same. The electronic locking mechanism was the same, but his relationship to them had transformed. He used to see them as a barrier, something necessary to repel invaders. Now he saw them as a symbol of choice, a reminder that he had the right to say no, the power to set boundaries, the ability to protect what was his, but also the capacity to choose when to open them, when to welcome people in, when to be part of something larger than himself. The gates had been open since the crisis ended. He kept them open most days now. Visitors came through regularly, students during educational programs, customers to the farm stand, other farmers interested in sustainable practices. The gates were no longer a weapons system. They were just gates. In the mailbox that afternoon, Marcus found a letter from the Tennessee State Board of Agriculture. It was an award notification. He'd been selected to receive the Tennessee Farmer of the Year award for his work in sustainable agriculture, his educational initiatives, and his advocacy for protecting agricultural land. The award would be presented at a statewide conference in Nashville in December. He read the letter 3 times in disbelief, then called Jim Bradshaw. "You're getting Farmer of the Year," Jim said when Marcus told him. "The guy who nearly destroyed himself fighting the HOA gets recognized for everything he's built. Life's funny." "It's poetic," Marcus agreed. "A year ago I was depressed and exhausted. Now I'm getting awards." "That's what building means," Jim said. "Fighting tears down, building creates, and you switched from fighting to building." That evening, Marcus walked the orchard in the gold light of late autumn. The leaves were turning, showing off colors they'd been building up to show for months. The apples had been harvested 2 weeks prior. This year's crop was excellent, 15% higher yield than the previous year. The pears were still on the trees, perfectly ripe, waiting to be picked in the next few days. This was the work. This was what mattered. Not the battles, not the legal victories, not the public recognition. The work was the constant, patient engagement with the growing cycle. The work was showing up, day after day, tending to things that would continue long after he was gone. He thought about his father, who had planted the first trees in 1977. His father had died not knowing how the orchard would be preserved, whether it would survive the pressures of development and time. Marcus had ensured it survived, and now he was ensuring it thrived in a way that benefited others, not just his own small preservation. That was the victory, he realized. Not that he'd defeated Pamela Westbrook, though he had, but that he'd transformed a defensive fight into something generative. He'd taken the crisis and made it into something meaningful. As the sun set on the orchard, painting everything in orange and gold, Marcus made a decision. When he received the Farmer of the Year award, he was going to use the platform to do something. He was going to tell the story of what had happened, not as a story of victory over an enemy, but as a story of property rights, of the pressures that family farms faced, of the importance of protecting agricultural land in the face of development pressures. He was going to make his personal battle into a larger conversation. That night he sat down and started writing, not for publication necessarily, but to organize his thoughts. He wrote about his father. He wrote about the orchard. He wrote about the moment when Pamela approached the gate. He wrote about the escalation, the legal battles, the depression, the rebuilding. He wrote about what he'd learned. By the time he finished, it was past midnight. The pages spread across his kitchen table told a story that was both specific and universal. A story about what happens when someone tries to take what's yours, what it costs to resist, and what comes after the resistance ends. The final paragraph, which he wrote at 12:47 a.m., read, "I used to think that protecting something meant keeping it unchanged, keeping it closed off from the world. I learned that this is a kind of death. Protection means preservation, yes, but it also means growth. It means inviting others in. It means allowing new chapters to be written on the foundation of what came before. 2 years ago, a woman tried to claim my property. I fought her and I won. But the real victory came not from the fight, but from what I built after the fight was over. I built education programs. I built community connections. I built a scholarship in my father's name. I built a future. That is the victory worth having, not the defeat of an enemy, but the creation of something that will outlast all of us." When December came, Marcus drove to Nashville for the award ceremony. It was held at the Farmers' Conference, an annual gathering of agricultural professionals, educators, and farmers from across Tennessee. Nearly 1,000 people were in attendance. When Marcus's name was called, he walked to the stage and accepted the award, a beautiful piece of wood carving shaped like a tree. The crowd applauded. In the speech that followed, Marcus told parts of his story. He talked about his father and the orchard's history. He talked about the pressures that agricultural land faced. He talked about the importance of property rights and community. But he also talked about something bigger. 2 years ago, he said, looking out at the crowd, I faced a situation where someone tried to take something that wasn't theirs. Many of us in agriculture face these pressures. We face pressures from development, from regulations, from people who don't understand what farming is. It's easy to respond to that pressure with only defense, with only resistance. But I learned something important. We don't win by fighting alone. We win by building community. We win by showing people why agriculture matters. We win by opening our property and our stories to others and trusting that understanding leads to protection. He held up the award. "This isn't an award for me," he said. "It's an award for every person who has stayed in agriculture despite the pressures, who has protected family land despite the odds, who has believed that some things are worth preserving. I accept this on their behalf and with gratitude for everyone who supported me when I needed it most." The applause was substantial. Afterward, people approached him throughout the evening, farmers with their own stories, educators interested in the programs he'd built, developers and state officials interested in agricultural preservation policies. He spent hours talking about what had happened, what he'd learned, and what the community could do to protect agricultural land while allowing it to remain economically viable. It was past midnight when he finally drove back to the orchard. The property was dark when he arrived, the trees invisible against the night sky. But he knew they were there, sleeping through the winter, storing up energy for spring. Marcus parked in front of the house and sat in the truck for a long moment, holding the award. He thought about calling someone to share the moment with: Jim, Patricia, even Victoria Torres. But in the end, he just wanted to sit with it, alone in the quiet. In the morning, when he walked the orchard in the pale light of a winter dawn, the crisis felt very far away. It had happened. It had mattered. It had changed him, but it no longer defined him. The gates stood open as they had throughout the autumn. The morning was clear and cold. In a few months, the trees would begin to bud. In a few more months, they would flower. In a few more months after that, the fruit would come. The cycle would continue, as it always had. And Marcus Chen, farmer and protector and builder, would tend to it all. He would watch over what his father had planted. He would nurture what he had fought to preserve. And he would open it generously to others, trusting that this was what inheritance meant, not just preservation, but sharing, not just protection, but growth. The orchard in that moment was exactly what it had always been: a gift from his father, a responsibility he had earned, and a legacy he would pass forward. And that, finally, was enough. Epilogue, the SEASONS repeat. 7 years after the crisis with Pamela Westbrook, on a warm evening in October, Marcus Chen sat on the porch of his farmhouse with a glass of wine, watching the sunset paint the orchard in copper and gold. The property had expanded now. Not in territory, the 85 acres remained the same, but in purpose and capacity. The educational programs had become a model that other farms were replicating. The scholarship fund had put 23 students through agricultural programs. The farm stand had been expanded and rebuilt, and now did over $200,000 in annual direct sales. Marcus was 58 years old. His dark hair had grayed at the temples. His face had the deep lines of someone who spent their life outdoors and thinking hard about things that mattered. But he was healthier than he'd been in years. The depression that had followed the crisis had lifted completely, replaced by a sense of purpose and engagement with life. The gates, which had once been locked in defiance, were now almost always open. They symbolized something different now. They symbolized choice, autonomy, and the capacity to welcome others into a space that was genuinely yours. His phone buzzed with a text message from Keisha Morrison, one of the scholarship recipients who'd returned to farming. She was starting a women's agricultural cooperative and wanted Marcus's advice. He texted back that he'd be happy to help. Another text came from Victoria Torres, now in her 4th year as HOA president. She was inviting him to speak at a community event about agricultural property rights. He accepted. Another text came from Patricia Hayes, his lawyer. She'd retired from her practice but remained a friend. She was inviting him to dinner next week. He said yes. The orchard had healed the legal wounds. It had healed the emotional wounds, too. And perhaps most importantly, it had given Marcus a way to transform the crisis into something meaningful, not by denying it had happened, but by making it part of a larger story about resilience, adaptation, and the importance of protecting what matters while remaining open to how it grows. As the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in shades of pink and orange and purple, Marcus thought about Pamela Westbrook. He didn't think about her often anymore. But when he did, it was without anger. She had tried to take something that wasn't hers. He had stopped her. She had left. Life had continued. There was no grand moral to the story he had come to understand. Just the simple truth that when you defend what's yours fiercely, when you refuse to be bullied, when you stand on principle, there are costs. But there are also victories. And the real work comes after the crisis ends, when you have to decide what you're going to build with what was saved. He stood up from his chair and walked toward the gates. They were open, as they almost always were now. He closed them gently, locking them for the night, not in defiance of anyone, but in the simple acknowledgement that even open spaces need boundaries. The key slid smoothly into the lock. It was the same key his great-grandfather had used 100 years ago. It was the same key his father had used. It was the same key he had grabbed in anger 7 years ago, ready to use it as a weapon. Now it was just a key, a tool, part of the ordinary machinery of maintaining a property and a life. He locked the gates and turned back toward the house. Behind him, in the darkness, the orchard settled into sleep. 93 acres of trees that had been there before his birth and would be there after his death. 132 years of continuous cultivation. 147 years of family history.